This is a March Madness square. It's a simple game played during the NCAA's men's basketball tournament. You get a group of your friends together. Everyone buys randomly assigned squares in the grid. Each square represents a potential score. The columns represent the last digit of the winning score, and the rows represent the last digit of the losing score. This past season, UConn defeated Purdue 75-60. Because the winning score ended with the number 5 and the losing score ended with the number 0, if you had possessed this square last year, you won a lot of money. There are currently 67 games played in the men's tournament, which means there are 67 opportunities for any one of these squares to hit. The later in the tournament your square hits, the bigger your payout. When I play, you pay $20 for every square you want to own. The first 4 in round of 64 have a $10 payout. The round of 32 pays out $20, the Sweet 16 pays out $40, the Elite 8 pays out $80, the Final 4 pays out $170, and the National Championship pays out $340. Those prices are per game. If your square hits multiple times late in the tournament, you can make a lot of money. In 2014, if you had possessed the square 0 beating 4, you would have won $460 off a $20 bet, thanks to Arizona beating San Diego State 70-64 in the Sweet 16, UConn beating Michigan State 60-54 in the Elite 8, and UConn finishing off Kentucky 60-54 in the National Championship game. March Madness squares require no skill. You don't need to know who's good or bad. You don't even need to know who's playing. The beauty of the squares is that they account for blowouts and nail-biters. It doesn't matter if the final score is 77-74 or 87-54. If you have that 7 beating 4 square, that cash is yours. This is nothing more than a game of luck. There are 100 possible outcomes for every game. It's an equal 1% chance of any square hitting. In a game scored by 1s, 2s, and 3s, there should be no preferred end result. March Madness squares are nothing more than an exercise in randomness. Right? In 1987, the NCAA tournament introduced the three-point line to the men's tournament. Since then, 2,392 tournament games have been played. We're using 1987 as our starting point to make sure that all the games in our sample were played under similar scoring rules. With that in mind, I want you to take a moment and make a guess. Since 1987, which of these 100 squares is the best? Remember that guess. March Madness squares are about 2 things: score and point differential. Both of those metrics can be shown on our grid. Rows and columns show us the final score, and the diagonals show us point differential. So when we're looking for our most common square, it's safe to assume it's none of these. All the squares in this diagonal have a winning and losing score that ends with the same last digit, so the point differential must end with a 0. Tournament games can't end as a tie, so the point differential of the games in these squares can be 10, 20, 30, meaning that all the squares in this diagonal don't account for any close games. This diagonal is limited in its ability to win. This is a bad group of squares to have. This diagonal contains 3 of the top 5 worst March Madness squares, including the outright worst square to have. So while we're talking about it, let's take a quick break to appreciate the hell that is 7 beating 7. This square sucks. Out of the 2,392 games in our sample, it has only hit 11 times. That's 0.46% of all games, and it's only becoming more rare. This graph shows the percentage of every possible square over time. It's crowded, but generally, all the lines trend toward this line here. That's 1%. If there are 100 possible outcomes, in the long run, everything should go to 1%. But not our square. It's running away, and it's running in the wrong direction. The most recent occurrence was in the 2021 tournament in the round of 32. The 11 seed UCLA Bruins trounced 14 seed Abilene Christian 67-47. This result was exciting given that this square had been dormant for 10 years. Its previous occurrence was in the 2011 Sweet 16, when Kansas ended Richmond's Cinderella run 77-57. By far the most exciting occurrence of this square was in 1995, when 13-seed Manhattan took out 4-seed Oklahoma in the opening round 77-67. 7 beating 7 is rare and boring. We do not like this square. We don't really like anything on this diagonal. We need to find somewhere on this grid where the squares account for close games and blowouts. Here's something that may help us. This graph shows us the point differential of every game since 1987. As expected, it generally trails off. Games are more often won by a margin of 2, 3, and 4 than 22, 33, or 44. It's not to say from time to time we're going to have a blowout. Speaking of, say hello to Kansas and Prairie View. Their game in 1998 is the second largest margin of victory in the history of the tournament, but the largest in our sample. Kansas won 110-52, which means if you had 0 beating 2 in 1998, you just earned $10 from a $20 bet. Congrats. Coming back in on this graph, we make the slow climb up the point differential mountain all the way back to single digits, where we can see that the most common point differential of March Madness since the addition of the 3-point line is 3 points. If only someone had used that new line. To fully understand how this graph relates to our game, we need to do a little smushing. In March Madness squares, a 3-point victory is equal to a 13-point victory. After a little addition, we can see the most common point differential by last digit. These columns are these diagonals. Now we can see that a point differential that ends in the number 2 is the most common result, trailed closely behind a difference ending in the number 3. Which means the square we're looking for is probably in one of these 2 diagonals. That's enough about point differential. Let's talk about the actual scores of the games. Of the 2,392 games, winning scores have most often ended in the number 5, and losing scores have most often ended in the number 8. That's a point differential of 7. Well, not a good start, but let's check it out. In 2021, 5 beating 8 brought us 12-seed Oregon State's improbable Sweet 16 victory over 8-seed Loyola Chicago, 65-58. In 2015, Wisconsin punched their ticket to the Final Four after they beat Arizona 85-78. And in 2010, St. Mary upset Villanova in the second round, 75-68. 8 beating 5 has occurred 25 times. This is not our square. Here's a graph that shows the occurrence of every square. All the way at this end is 7 beating 7. We were just here, 5 beating 8. We want to get here. Let's revise our search for best square using another graph. Here we see how often any number was the final digit of either team's score. A quick note about this graph, check the axes. All the digits are fairly common, happening between 18 and 21% of all games. We chopped the majority of the graph off to make the difference of each square more visually noticeable. Here we can see that the 2 most common scores end in 8 and 3. 8 beating 3 and 3 beating 8 are both a point differential of 5, which is better than our previous square, but from the point differential graph, we can already get the sense that these are not the squares we're looking for. 8 beating 3 includes Duke's 2015 national title victory over Wisconsin, 68-63. 3 beating 8 includes Fairleigh Dickinson's improbable 63-58 win over Purdue in 2023. These 2 squares appear here on our occurrence graph, which confirms we need to look elsewhere. Let's try to take point differential into account with the possible final scores. We're looking for a point differential of 2 or 3. Using the most common final digits, we have a handful of options to check out. 8 beating 5, the inverse of a previous guess. We also have 5 beating 3, 5 beating 2. We'll even try 1 beating 8. Let's check these out, starting with 8 beating 5. Here we see Coppin State becoming the third 15 seed to win a game, upsetting South Carolina 78-65. This square has occurred 29 times. That's marginal improvement. Next we'll try 5 beating 3. This square is home to Luke May's infamous 2017 shot that pushed UNC into the Final Four over Kentucky 75-73. This square has occurred 31 times. We're combining what we know about point differential and final scores to find the best square, and now we're heading in the right direction. So let's keep trying. Here is 1 beating 8. Hey look, it's Oral Roberts' 81-78 win over Florida. This 2021 game is one of 32 times this square was hit. We go on. Traveling across the grid to 5 beating 2, we see Northern Iowa's buzzer beater to upset Texas 75-72. This square has occurred 37 times, and yet it sits just outside the top 5 of most occurring squares. The square with the most occurrences has happened 43 times, and it isn't too far away. Let me introduce you to 4 beating 1. 4 beating 1 is a difference of 3. That's our second best point differential. 4 and 1 are moderately common squares, ranking 5th and 6th for most common final digit. And yet here it is, number 1, above all the rest. Amongst those 43 times 4 beating 1 has occurred, includes Duke's 54-51 victory over Houston in this past year's Sweet 16, Cal Berkeley upsetting UNLV in the first round of the 23 tournament 64-61, and Butler outlasting Florida in overtime of the 2011 Elite Eight 74-71. 4 beating 1 has been the result of 1.8% of all games in our sample. That's 0.8 above the expected percentage. My statistics knowledge is not the best. I'm not going to tell you that this is outside the standard deviation or indicative of a trend. Again, this game is random. 30 years we'll be telling a different story about different squares. But right here, right now, in 2025, it's the most common square. So it's the best, right? It depends. Remember that really bad square from earlier, 7 beating 7? It has a twin. This is 1 beating 3. It has occurred 12 times in our sample, one more than 7 beating 7, but those 12 times have only happened in 9 tournaments, making it the least occurring square per tournament. That's 24% of tournaments in our sample. 7 beating 7 has happened in 10 tournaments, or 27%. Our twin nightmare square had one good year, 1992, where 1 beating 3 happened 3 times. 12-seeded New Mexico State upset 5-seed DePaul 81-73, then took out 13-seed Southwest Louisiana by the same score. Also, Syracuse beat Princeton in that same tournament 51-43. Even a bad square can have a good year, but 1 beating 3 is the worst this metric has to offer. Why does that matter? Well, let's revisit our current champion, 4 beating 1. Those 43 occurrences have happened in 59% of tournaments in our sample, or 22 of the 37. That means in 41% of tournaments, the square does nothing. It's a feast or famine square. When it hits big, but it doesn't hit as often as you'd like. So if you want to risk it, 4 beating 1 is a good square. But maybe you're like me, you want more consistency, a square that's reliable. Travel with me a few spaces over. This is 2 beating 0. This square hits in 76% of tournaments. That's 28 out of 37, 6 more than 4 beating 1. And 2 beating 0 has hit 42 times. That's only 1 less than the other square. 2 beating 0 has had its fair share of fun games. This past year, Colorado outlasted Florida in the opening round, 102-100. In 2021, Arkansas ended Oral Roberts' Cinderella run, 72-70. And in 2010, Butler punched their ticket to the national title game by defeating Michigan State 52-50. 2 beating 1 is great. It hits frequently both per tournament and in each tournament. If you had this square in the past, it made you a lot of money. Wait, this game's about making money. I took the result of every square and used the payout rules I laid out earlier to calculate how much each square has made you. The worst square in terms of payout is one of those evil twins. 1 beating 3 has gifted $180 over 37 tournaments. Our current favorite, 2 beating 0, has made a solid $1,130 over its 42 occurrences. That amount of money doesn't even crack the top 5 best payouts by the squares. Another of our favorites, 4 beating 1, has made $1,270. Still, it only lands at 4 on our list. We have to travel just next door to find our breadwinner. 3 beating 1 has made $1,520 from its 38 occurrences, appearing in 62% of all tournaments in our sample. It's the 4th most occurring square, and tied for 4th in most tournaments occurred in. You would have hit big if you had it in 2011 when UConn beat Butler 53-41 in the national title game. You'd also make some decent cash from it when Michigan State defeated Wisconsin in the 2000 Final Four, also 53-41. Or, more excitingly, when Michigan, University of, beat Illinois 83-81 in the 1989 Final Four. So here's where we stand. We've got a few squares that could all make a case at being the best square. You have 4 beating 1 with the most appearances by game. You have 2 beating 0 with the most appearances by tournament. And you have 3 beating 1 with the most money earned. We need a metric to evaluate all these variables and give us a clear answer. Enter the MMSI, the March Madness Squares Index, created by yours truly. We divide the total amount of money made by the amount of times the square is hit. This gives us money per game. Check this out. 9 beating 2 makes the most money per game. It's only happened 21 times and occurred in 41% of tournaments. It's not in the top 10 of money made, but here it is. When it hits hard, almost tripling your price of entry. 9 beating 2 has treated us to the 2018 National Championship game, where Villanova, go Cats, beat Michigan 79-62, as well as the 2009 National Championship game where UNC defeated Michigan State 89-72. Just this past year, Alabama beat Clemson 89-82 in the Elite Eight. We need to get a sense of how reliable this money per game stat is per tournament. We multiply it by the percentage of tournaments the square has occurred in, and here we get the MMSI. This index can help us rank the best squares. Our 9 beating 2 places 6th with an MMSI score of 23.90. As we climb up to first, we'll discover that only one of the 3 squares we identified as the best square appears here, and it appears at number 1. 3 beating 1 leads the MMSI with a score of 24.86, standing over 6 beating 2 by only 0.01. 6 beating 2, you had a good fight. You gave us Arkansas defeating Duke in the national championship 76-72. You gave us UConn over Alabama in last year's Final Four 86-72. You gave us a vacated 76-72 Final Four Michigan victory over Cincinnati. But before we crown a champion, I want to return here. Remember this graph where we mapped out the percentage of every result over time? We have this line here, 1%, where all these other lines should go to over time. I like to think of this line as gravity, and the long-run gravity will always win. These more frequent results should come back down, while these less frequent results should rise. March Madness squares are random. Every result is mutually exclusive. We found the most common scores and the most common point differential, and at least one of those metrics was violated in our potential best squares. That should remind us that all of this is random. Even the MMSI can barely decide on one definitively good square. The fact that 43 games have resulted in a final score of 4 beating 1 doesn't mean that during this coming tournament we should expect that result to be any more likely to occur than the 99 other possible results. But the fact that 4 beating 1 is a 3-point margin of victory kind of does. These teams are the 68 best in college basketball. The games should be close. They should be decided by a possession or two. That's why I think scores that end with a point differential of 1, 2, 3, and 4 generally sit above gravity. Look at a heat map of all the results. The more common squares ride the diagonals that associate with closer point differentials. So if you're ever faced with the opportunity to pick your March Madness square, here are some squares that have historically performed better. But none of this is certain. Even the worst squares have occasional good years, and the best squares only happen 76% of the time. That means roughly once in every 4 years it won't hit at all. And even though these squares have been the winners in their diagonal, for all we know, 2025 is the year that 9 beating 6 or 3 beating 0 decide to catch up to its 3-point companions. Fortunately, March Madness squares are assigned at random. But if you play this year, you get 2 beating 0, 4 beating 1, or 3 beating 1. Maybe someone's looking out for you. But if you get 7 beating 7 or 1 beating 3, you might need new friends. Because let's be real, there's no such thing as random.